October 6, 1973, Egyptian troops crossed the Suez Canal, taking the Israelis completely by surprise. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Large numbers of Israeli soldiers were in synagogue. In the early days of the war, Sadat's troops and their allies, the Syrians, destroyed more than 100 Israeli tanks and killed more than 2,000 Israeli soldiers.
This was a great psychological boost for the Egyptians to have been able to surprise the Israelis and successfully begin to recapture that territory.
The tide eventually turned after the U.S. launched an airlift to replenish Israel's lost equipment. The Israelis surrounded part of Sadat's army and were threatening to annihilate it when the Soviet Union announced it was preparing to come to Egypt's aid. Suddenly, the conflict was threatening to escalate into a major superpower confrontation.
This certainly raised the flags for the Americans and for Henry Kissinger and the president.
Sadat knew his army couldn't defeat the Israelis. Military victory was never his goal. What he wanted was to force President Nixon and National Security Advisor Kissinger, who had seemingly lost interest in the Arab-Israeli conflict, to become re-involved.
He believed that without their direct involvement, the Arab-Israeli conflict could not be resolved. He believed the U.S. in particular held 90% of the cards, and there was no way of getting the U.S. to intervene unless there was a major crisis.
Sadat had staked his presidency on the outcome of the war. He was betting on a quick ceasefire and a diplomatic settlement favorable to Egypt.
For Sadat, this was an act of the most extreme courage because the results could have been quite different.
16 days after the war began, the UN finally arranged a ceasefire. Then, events took a turn Sadat never dreamed of. Arab oil producers spearheaded an oil embargo against the U.S. for supporting Israel. As a result, oil prices worldwide quadrupled, and Middle East oil producers suddenly found themselves awash in money. Responding to the crisis, President Nixon sent his national security advisor shuttling between Jerusalem and Cairo, trying to negotiate a resolution to the Egyptian-Israeli conflict.
All of these meant that the U.S. suddenly reshuffled its global priorities to focus primarily on addressing this issue. That's exactly what Sadat wanted. That's exactly what he expected.
Sadat's strategy had worked better than he could have imagined. After 3 years of living in Nasser's shadow, he was emerging as a dynamic new leader of the Egyptian people.
The war made Sadat into a national hero. I mean, everybody was convinced that he had accomplished what Nasser had tried to do and never could do. They were surprised by their own success, and it gave them an enormous boost of pride.
Sadat's dramatic gamble changed the Middle East landscape. The U.S. was now pressuring Israel to negotiate a withdrawal from the Sinai. The Israelis could no longer dismiss Egypt's military as inept. If Israel refused to negotiate, it did so at its own peril. Anwar Sadat's strategy to bring the U.S. into the Arab-Israeli conflict as a mediator had worked. 3 months after the 1973 war ended, the United Nations brokered an agreement for a partial Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. When negotiations for a second withdrawal broke down, Sadat rolled the dice once again. With Israeli artillery still in range, Sadat announced that Egyptian engineers would begin clearing the Suez Canal of debris from the '67 war and reopen it to international shipping.
It was a very smart move on the part of Sadat to declare the clearing of the canal. What Sadat did was he got the entire world salivating over having the canal open again, because it was a costly proposition not to be able to move through the canal.
The years following the '73 war were heady times for Sadat and Egypt. The U.S. pumped in large amounts of foreign aid. Sadat opened Egypt's economy to foreign investment. He watched other Arab states getting rich from skyrocketing oil prices and envisioned large investments flowing into his country.
The city that we are going to see now, the 10th of Ramadan, is the first one. I'm planning for a chain of cities on this 100 kilometers. A chain of cities and factories. Pioneering, real pioneering.
In fact, large sums of money did flow to Egypt, but it wasn't shared equally.
As a result of the war and the subsequent opening of Egypt and the American aid, the upper and upper middle classes of Egypt prospered. Foreign goods came in. There was a degree of affluence that hadn't been seen in those classes. But nothing changed for the vast majority of the Egyptian public.
In fact, things got worse. Between 1973 and 76, inflation sent prices soaring. To keep staples like bread, rice, and cooking gas affordable for the average Egyptian, Sadat subsidized the prices by borrowing large sums of money from foreign lenders. By 1977, the foreign debt was so large he was forced to cut subsidies and allow prices to rise. That triggered widespread rioting. Many of the protesters blamed Sadat personally. Sadat dresses in style, they shouted, while we live 7 to a room.
And people went out into the streets chanting, "Hero of the crossing, where's breakfast?" They were running out of tea, they were running out of sugar, they couldn't afford things, there was inflation in the country.
At the time of the riots, Sadat was spending about half Egypt's annual budget on the military. The riots convinced him that Egypt simply couldn't afford guns and butter. To care for its people, it had to make peace with Israel. Sadat knew that after 3 decades of bloodshed, negotiations would be extremely difficult. He needed a way to break through the years of hatred and mistrust.
It was typical of Sadat that when he starts to get frustrated, he looks to the kind of move that will create a major impression, that will have a major impact on changing the ground.
Sadat considered several options. Characteristically, he chose the most dramatic. A solo journey into the enemy's heartland. Sadat's advisors opposed his going. Palestinian extremists threatened to assassinate him if he did. But once again, Sadat summoned the courage to do what he thought was best for Egypt. A devout Muslim, he put his faith in Allah.
One day he told me, "Don't worry, because you are not going to add 1 minute or take 1 minute. It's my faith. Whenever it's finished, then nobody can add anything."
On the drive to Jerusalem to address the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, he was delighted by the crowds of spectators who had turned out to cheer his arrival. Some had lost loved ones in the '73 war. At the Knesset, his arrival was heralded with trumpets and applause. And then he spoke the words Israelis had waited so long to hear.
You wish to live amongst us in this part of the world, and we tell you with all sincerity that we welcome you amongst us with all safety and security.
In return, Sadat asked Israel to recognize the rights of the Palestinians to their own homeland and to return to Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, lands captured in the '67 war. Sadat's precedent-shattering trip lasted just 36 hours. Before leaving, he made time to meet with an old enemy, former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir.
Let us decide one thing. It must go on, face to face, between us and between you, so that even an old lady like I am will live to see the day. You always call me an old lady, Mr. President.
Sadat's trip to Jerusalem was the beginning of a long and difficult journey. A month later, Prime Minister Begin flew to Cairo to begin the peace talks.